Hello, my name is Maria. In this executive brief, I evaluate Starbucks' international strategy through the lens of market entry architecture, corporate social responsibility credibility, and decision quality under regulatory and political constraint. Because when a company scales globally, it does not simply multiply revenue streams. It multiplies exposure to institutional complexity, stakeholder scrutiny, and reputational risk. Starbucks provides a compelling case study because it has experienced both strong international growth and visible tension in foreign markets. This allows us to assess not only why what worked, but why certain choices carried hidden consequences. To ground this discussion properly, I will begin by outlining who Starbucks is as an organization and how its global footprint shaped its strategic options before examining how those choices translated into specific entry structures abroad. Starbucks is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. It operates a vertically integrated premium coffee retail model supported by branded consumer packaged goods, digital ordering systems, loyalty platforms, and a highly standardized store experience architecture. Its value position centers on premium positioning, customer experience differentiation, and brand consistency, rather than cost leadership alone. Internationally, Starbucks operates across dozens of countries with particularly strong exposure in Asian specific markets, where China and Japan represent a significant revenue driver and where growth trajectories often outpace domestic expansion. This scale transforms Starbucks from a retailer into a multinational enterprise whose performance depends on navigating heterogeneous regulatory environments, cultural expectations, and labor norms, along with political sensitivities. Understanding that structure is really essential because the manner in which Starbucks entered foreign markets was not incidental. It was shaped by risk, legitimacy needs, and institutional barriers, which brings us directly into the discussion of strategic design. Starbucks has employed a portfolio of entry strategies rather than a single uniform template. In some markets, it has relied on licensing agreements to accelerate scale while limiting capital intensity. In others, it formed jointly ventures to secure institutional legitimacy and local expertise. And in more mature markets, it increased ownership to regain operational control and strategic agility. For example, in India, Starbucks entered through a joint venture with Tata Group. This structure mitigated political risk, facilitated regulatory navigation, and enabled localized supply chain integration. In China, the company initially relied on partnerships due to foreign ownership restrictions and later consolidated ownership as the regulatory environment evolved and the strategic value of tighter integration increased. The advantage of flexible architecture is adaptability. However, the trade-off of governance is complex. Slower consensus processes and potential dilution of decision autonomy. These trade-offs are not merely operational, they shape brand perception and stakeholder trust, which leads directly into ethical dimension of global operation. Starbucks has positioned itself as a leader in ethical sourcing and responsible supply chain governance. However, public scrutiny intensified when allegations surfaced regarding labor conditions within portions of its international supply chain, particularly in regions where subcontracting and labor oversight presents structural challenges. The ethical issue was therefore not simply about labor, it concerned transparency, credibility, and the alignment between corporate messaging and operational verification capacity. When firms operate across multiple regulatory regimes, Especially in developing markets, supply chain can create reputational exposure even when formal compliance frameworks exist. The question then becomes whether response mechanisms were sufficiently transparent and institutionally grounded, which naturally translate into the evaluation of the adequacy of Starbucks' response and structural pressure shaping it. Starbucks responded by reinforcing auditing systems, reiterating supplier standards, and emphasizing third-party verification frameworks. However, the strategic lesson extends beyond compliance reinforcement. Corporate social responsibility functions as a reputational asset only when claims remain precisely calibrated to enforce oversight. When market language communicates certainty that exceeds controlled mechanisms, even in strong CSR framework can become vulnerable in credibility erosion. A more robust approach could include explicit scope limitations in public claims, time-bound remediation disclosure, and measurable corrective action reporting to reinforce accountability, whether the reassurance alone. The ethical recalibration is not separate from strategy. It directly affects political trust, regulatory relationships, and market entry sustainability. Which brings us to the core decision-making process Starbucks faced in expanding in India. Expansion in India required Starbucks to evaluate a complex matrix of regulatory constraints, consumer purchasing power distribution, infrastructure variability, and competitive intensity from both domestic and conglomerates and global entrants. The joint venture with Tata reduced institutional friction and distributed capital risks. However, it introduced shared governance, profit allocation constraints, and slower strategic pivot capacity. The expected benefits included legitimacy transfer accelerated by supply chain localization and alignment with Indian sourcing regulations. The risk included regulatory volatility, foreign direct investment sensitivity, pricing pressure in value-conscious markets, and digital competition from e-commerce enabled platforms. Assessing whether this was a sound decision requires a balancing institutional stability against control optimization, and that assessment informs forward-looking recommendations for strengthening long-term international strategy. Looking forward, Starbucks should treat entry mode not as a fixed identity choice, but as a dynamic, controlled calibration mechanism. Partnership may be optimal during early institutional learning phases, yet gradual equity consolidation may be advantageous once the local operational capabilities and regulatory familiarity have reached maturity. Simultaneously, the company should strengthen local leadership pipelines, deepening digital integration tailored to Indian consumer behavior, and institutionalize credibilities for CSR communication standards that tie public commitments directly to verifiable performance metrics. By integrating strategic flexibility with ethical precision, Starbucks can align profitability with legitimacy, which allows us to synthesize the broader lessons drawn from this case before closing. Starbucks illustrates that global expansion is not a linear scaling exercise. It is an iterative negotiation among market opportunity, political exposure, institutional trust, and reputational discipline. Entry mode choices determine governance flexibility, CSR execution determines credibility resilience, and local partnership depth determines long-term legitimacy. When these variables are treated as interdependent rather than isolated, multinational strategy becomes strategically stronger and ethically defensible. To support the analytical framework presented here, I conclude this with the sources,